Welcome back to the live stream. It's been 5 months. We're back. We don't have a name anymore. We used to be Steve and Friends, but now we're just Steve Keen Live. Steve Keen live streaming. Ask an economist a question. Oh, Steve's got the new handle. His marketing handle is Top Economist. Ask a top economist a question. So basically, in the chat, put your questions in there. We're going to try to go through as many as possible, make this stream interactive. I'm going to bring on Steve first, check in with how he's doing. Steve, welcome.
Not too bad, mate. I'm just, usual story, too much to do, too little time. And as you know, I've got a visitor this time around sitting right next to me. There's Dirk Entz. There you go. That's him. In his own camera.
We were supposed to do that in sequence, but you've kind of ruined it. So Dirk Entz is on the show. We'll bring him in.
Okay.
And we've already got echo problems, so that'll be interesting to deal with throughout the whole show. So everybody, get your questions in. Dirk, how you doing? You've been on the show twice. So maybe a year ago was the last time you were on. Back when we were fancier. We're less fancy now. But anyways, how you doing?
Yeah, thanks for asking, and thanks for having me on the show. I'm doing fine. I got a new job, by the way. I work at the European Parliament as an assistant. So I had to clear this appearance on your show with the administration of the European Union. But it was all right.
Well, I'll definitely be on my best behavior. That changes the calculus of this entire show. Anyways, I'm seeing people roll in. Mike, Tony, Abdullah. Make sure you have any questions. Put them in. Here's a question here. Why do you hate classic economic theory? You said that before it's linear and calculus can be implemented. Can you elaborate for me? Steve, do you want to take that question? Maybe it was directed at me. Who knows?
Oh, let's get all three of us in there. And I hope Mike turns up at some point as well to really give a bit of background on that front. It's not classic. It's classic is not a bad term for it. It's the mainstream original neoclassical stuff that began back in the 1870s, and a whole lot of reasons as to why it's totally inappropriate. It's had more logical contradictions than Ptolemy's epicycles have had. And as Tony is sitting there, it doesn't work. That alone is enough to say, why the hell are we using a theory whose main distinction is all the ways in which it fails to make logical sense? But the main thing there about linear, that's actually quite an intriguing element to start with, because the models that economists build, which they call dynamic, stochastic, general equilibrium models, one essential element of the capacity to solve them is to argue that behavioral relationships are linear. So if you have a shock of size X, that will cause half as much damage as a shock of size 2X. There's every disturbance is going to be amplified by the same extent, and there's no nonlinear feedbacks that make things complicated. Of course, the real world ends up being completely nonlinear. So you get feedbacks that undermine the linear projections you make. And that's one of the many reasons why it's an inappropriate way of means to model capitalism. There's many, many others, but my simple description of neoclassical economics, it's neat, it's plausible, and it's wrong. That hardly helps, but I might actually load a couple of models and show what we mean by nonlinearity. And will you handle that, Ty? I'm pushing my luck to show a video.
No, you can load your videos. Dirk, I want your opinion on the question from the viewer.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree that the world is ruled by fundamental uncertainty. So this kind of linear stuff is just not appropriate for this world. And also the idea that there's always these exogenous shocks that they're talking about. That's also something which is not proper for the economics discipline. If there's a shock, we need to explain it. Where does it come from? And that is something which we should be talking about instead of having some kind of mechanistic model which cannot explain these differences that arise from these different shocks, let's say.
Yeah. And my main reason is that if you simply start from macroeconomic definitions, you end up with a world in which nonlinear relationships dominate and which money matters. And the neoclassical theory assumes linear to get away from the curly problems of being unable to solve nonlinear systems, and they leave the finance sector out. So like, let's see if I can actually, I'm trying to find how I share my screen on this window. Let's see. How do I do that?
Been
There
a while, maybe.
I've found it. So I share this one. I don't know how visible that turns out being. Can you see it?
I heard it. Oh, there we go. Here we go.
Okay.
Let me cue this up right so it looks pretty for everybody. We'll get
Yep.
rid of the chat here. There we go.
Okay, so this is a very simple model that has output determining employment, determining the employment rate, determining the rate of change of wages, giving you labour times wages, and that's a nonlinearity. If you have wages being a function of the level of employment and the level of employment itself turning up, then what you've got is a quasi-quadratic. You're multiplying one one system state by another, you're going to get a product of the two, which is like having a quadratic inside the system. Then I have output minus wages minus interest, gives you profit, gives you a rate of profit, gives you a level of investment, determines capital stock and comes back and determines employment. And if you simulate this model, you don't get equilibrium. At the moment, I am getting equilibrium because I've left out payment of interest. But you include payment of interest inside there, and you get a system which is cyclical and which can break down over time, which is what we've seen in the real world. So this sort of phenomenon, with an incredibly simple model, generates the basics of what occurred in 2008, led to the financial crisis. Now, the mainstream has got nothing like that. They didn't see the damn crisis coming. We can get this out of extremely simple models that basically just simply say money matters in a capitalist economy and debt matters because that's what creates money, and instability and non-equilibrium is the rule, not the neoclassical obsessions that you have equilibrium applying all the time. So that's why we don't like the neoclassical model. It's simply unrealistic, and for a whole range of reasons.
So just to tell everybody, this is the basic Goodwin growth cycle model, and you extended it with a third system state, obviously, including debt. But just to let everybody that kind of wants to know and wants to get into economic modeling, nonlinear economic modeling, like macroeconomic modeling, this is a perfect model to start out with. Specifically, even before you get into a more advanced Steve Keen model, just do the Goodwin growth cycle model and see those nonlinear dynamics. The coolest thing about that model is it's just the Goodwin model is just two system states creates that nonlinear pattern. You see, it's incredible. It's basically predator prey model. It's just interesting stuff. It's what got me down the road in economic modeling was that initiation.
You're being asked to put your volume up, by the way, Ty. Some of the commenters saying I can't hear you.
Okay, so let's do the technical housekeeping.
Okay.
Everybody, let me know. Am I louder now? Do I sound
not really?
better?
No. Pump up the volume. Let's see.
Let's press some settings here. I'll try some interface settings. Audio and audio gain. How's that sounding? Am I louder now? Testing.
No change whatsoever that I can tell. What about our commentators? Can you hear anything different, Tony?
Freaks, you're always into that. Am I a little? The problem is in our interface, we hear each other. It's perfectly balanced, but when it gets sent out to YouTube or it gets messed up.
Didn't change a thing. He's saying, yeah.
Didn't change a thing. Let me try one more thing before we carry on here. Am I using the right mic source? Yeti microphone. Yeah, I'm on my right microphone. High resolution, suppression, cancellation. I've turned everything on crank up my gain a little bit more here.
Okay. Now you definitely will hear you. Yeah, okay.
Okay.
You even sound like a Canadian.
Tell me.
Okay.
Yeah, tell me if I'm too loud now. I saw another question here from Algorithm. It was actually pertaining to a Richard Murphy, so maybe we'll just get your thoughts here on what Algorithm said. So Richard Murphy said the world has a glut of savings and it is a huge problem. 2 weeks ago in a YouTube video. What does your Ravel model say?
Well, it's actually not a stock of savings that matters so much. It's a stock of debt that matters so much, and it's private debt that matters. This is and Richard and I are on a similar wavelength on that front. I'd have to actually see that particular video to see why he argued that savings is the problem. But fundamentally, we have two ways to create money in a bank account. Banks can lend out more than they take back in repayments. That increases deposits as well as increasing debt. And that's the sum of the deposit accounts is what we call money. And then the government spending more than it gets back in taxation. So in terms of a large amount of government money creation for some substantial time ever since COVID, plus average levels of credit compared to the last 40 or 50 years, you've got increasing savings accounts, but it's not the savings that matters. I'll need to watch that video and make sure, because I'm sure there was a twist in how Richard had presented that. But he would be a critic of the argument that excess savings is causing our trouble. It's not excess savings, it's excess creation of private debt. So,
isn't that a typical Ben Bernanke type argument?
Yeah. That was the argument, excessive savings.
Yeah. Thoughts on what Richard Murphy allegedly said without seeing the video?
Yeah, well, it's very difficult to speculate about this, but of course the idea of having too much savings is just wrong, because if you think that you have too much savings, you can just spend the money and then somebody else will help hold this money and there will still be savings. So saving is money not spent, and savings is the stock of that. So the world as a whole cannot really get rid of these savings. And of course, when you have more economic activity because people want to get rid of the savings, then you will have also more tax revenues. And then private sector saving does go down. So it is kind of unlikely that what Richard Murphy said makes sense in an MMT world, where we see savings as the outcome of a myriad of decisions in the economy. And it's just the opposite of public debt, basically.
Right. I'm going to get Dirk, you to go into your settings, and we'll do echo cancellation. Your mic is picking up Steve's speakers or somebody's speakers.
Excuse me, possibly coming across the mic. We're in the same room, which is pushing our luck a bit here, people. So that might be a problem.
So,
but
Dirk, there's gear cog. And then once you're in your, you can just use your mic.
Okay. Maybe this. Okay, let's see if it's any better.
Let's see if it's
try it out, Dirk.
Yeah,
you sound better.
Change the settings. So is it better?
Yeah.
Now I need you to go into your echo cancellation. So that's in your gear cog, and then go to audio, and then the top option should be echo cancellation.
Turn it off or turn it on?
Turn it on.
Yeah, it's been on all the time.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's going to be a little bit difficult to do this with you guys in the same room, but we'll chug through it.
We'll give it a try.
Anybody, you've got questions? Make sure. Steve, are you? Let's got. Here's one from Toko. Steve, have you ever used Ravel to show lawyers, judges, arguments around things like government spending? We know you did have a case in Australia many years ago.
Yeah. Yeah, that predated me building Minsky, but it didn't predate my knowledge of money creation by private banks, obviously. And that's the reason I was asked to be an expert witness. So there was a court case involving a predatory loan from a lawyer whose name is Creminizer, and I will not mention that you can turn that into Criminalizer, which may or may not have been his nickname. But he gave loans to it started off with a guy who was a worker in a delivery company, truck driver, and the company then reorganized itself to make all its employees independent contractors. Of course, paid them a smaller amount of money than they got as wage slaves at that time, and he could no longer pay his mortgage with the Commonwealth Bank, so he applied for a mortgage with. He got turned down by all the 4 banks in Australia. Interestingly enough, they were responsible about not lending him money at the time. But then he went for this lawyer who also had a side business of loans, obviously not bank loans, gave him 6 consecutive loans. The guy folded 6 consecutive times, and when he tried for a 7th loan, he foreclosed and wanted to take the house over. So we were saying that the lending itself should not be enforced. And the difficult thing for judges is that judges are normally there to enforce contracts, to enforce laws. So the whole idea that they can say a contract can be terminated takes something which means there's deleterious impact on parties that aren't the people that aren't parties to the contract. And the case that I made was that the rising level of private debt was causing a financial crisis. Of course, it did 2 years later. And therefore, the excessive lending was causing house price bubbles, which led to too much private debt, which would lead to a financial crisis. So I got to demonstrate this same model that I'm showing here, but at that stage I was using MathCAD rather than my double entry bookkeeping and Ravel to make the case. But I'd love to do the same thing now with Ravel itself, because what Ravel lets me do is show the actual double entry bookkeeping behind government spending. And it's so easy to show that the dangers that people like Musk and co are paranoid about and obsessing about only occur if the textbook model of banking is correct, which is loanable funds. And about 11 years ago now, the Bank of England joined myself and a number of other heretics to say the textbook models are wrong. So therefore, if you got a wrong model, you think you're going to get disasters, it's because you've got the wrong model, not because it's the actual situation that's going to occur. So I'd love to be sitting in front of a judge and showing this, because with the judges, I don't get them to listen. The judges, I mean, having done a law degree myself some time ago, they're not going to be beholden to thinking in neoclassical terms. If I show them the results, I go, oh yeah, fair enough, that's true, not a problem. Well, in the case of that predatory loan, I got the loan terminated. So the guy still ended up having to sleep in a tent. He lost his house, but he didn't have to pay the final debt back to the criminalizer lender. So I have done it once. I'd love to do it again, because now when I can do the modeling now and I can show the actual double entry bookkeeping, then it's much more straightforward for people like judges to understand what I'm talking about. So yeah, let me into the and the politicians as well. But that's, we're fighting against a conventional wisdom which is so deeply entrenched that it's virtually impossible to get attention from people who are the policymakers, journalists. They all fall back to thinking in the textbook terms. So it's an enormous frustration for me. And I think everybody who works in the general field of modern monetary theory and anybody who understands banking, it's a huge frustration to see all this crazy debate going on about the government going bankrupt.
Great. So anybody who's got questions about ECB monetary policy, we have a world-leading expert here with us today. So make sure you ask those questions. We got another one here from Saltwater Sky. I don't know if that's like a play on, saltwater economics and freshwater economics, or it's just a name. To what extent was the neoclassical turn a reaction to Marxian crisis business cycle theory? Always seemed politically motivated to me. Dirk or Steve, any comments on that?
You want to take that one, Dirk, or will I dive in? You hit it first.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I mean, to some extent, it's true that the Marxist analysis was something which the liberals had to attack, and they probably used the neoclassical economics to stop talking about these terms like rent, for example. So rent is a very typical term that comes up in Adam Smith and also in Marx, and it is what Mariana Mazzucato talks about when she talks about the value creation and the extraction of value. So Michael Hudson calls this the fire sector, finance, insurance, real estate, and they are skimming off profits. And also Varoufakis talks about techno-feudalism and talks about the App Store, for example, run by Apple, where Apple gets 30% of all the turnover, but they're not really doing anything. So that, of course, would be something which you would describe in the terms of Marx rent. And if you go back to neoclassical economics, then of course you have returns to capital, but there's no more rent in that sense. So that's my take. Maybe I guess Steve has more to say about that.
Yeah, and certainly Marx. The reason that the neoclassicals arose at the time that Marx had just finished writing Das Kapital is that before Marx developed the analysis in Das Kapital, which began back in the 1840s when he went from being a philosopher to an economist, he turned the classical school of economics, which was a critique of the feudal system and a defense of capitalism, he turned it to an attack on capitalism. So you had from some 1776 from Adam Smith right through to the 1850s, the dominant classical school with people like Ricardo, Smith, to some extent Malthus. You had a libertarian focus on the classical school. They were anti-government regulation. They were anti all the feudal imposts. So it was pro the merchants. It was part of the whole transition from feudalism to capitalism. So in that sense, classical school was pro-capitalist. And then Marx came along, and one thing which neither Smith nor Ricardo ever worked out is where profit came from, intriguingly enough. So if you've read Smith, you may have seen the phrase about if a beaver costs twice as much to kill as a deer, then one beaver should exchange for 2 deer. In other words, the amount of labor time taken to make something is what set prices in the classical school. Now, when they came to saying where does profit come from, the best that Smith could muster was to say that once capital had accumulated in the hands of industrious people, as he put it, in the wealth of nations, they would then hire workers to work with those tools to make goods and services. And therefore, I said, something must be given for the profits, something, no particular determination. So what Marx did was take the basic case the classical school made, that everything exchanges its cost of production, and applied that to labour and said, what's the cost of production of labour? It's the goods and services necessary to keep a worker alive. So effectively, that's a subsistence wage. And he said, what does the worker do when the worker is hired? The worker works in a factory. And there's no relationship between how long they're supposed to work in the factory and making the means of subsistence. So Marx's simple example said, let's say it takes 6 hours of labour to make the goods and services necessary to keep a worker alive. That's the cost of that's what's called labour power. Maybe the capacity to do labour is maintained by consuming a subsistence bundle of commodities. But what you actually then do, you go and work in a factory, and that's labour. And that can go on for, say, 12 hours. So the gap between labour and labour power, 12 hours versus 6 hours, Marx called that surplus value and said that's where profit comes from. So he explained all profit as effectively being, in a sense, exploitation of workers, though Marx himself argued it wasn't exploitation. They were simply being treated the same as any other commodity in capitalism. So what that meant was you now had an argument effectively that all the profit was created by all the value was created by workers. Why don't workers get all of the output? And that became part of the generic socialist revolt that occurred in the 19th century in the UK in particular, but also lots of Europe and parts of America as well. But people when they look back, they don't actually think in context what would have been like to be in England 150 years ago, because we're talking Marx. I mean, it's the 18. It's almost 2 centuries ago. He was writing it. He moved to England, I think, in 1847. So we're talking, virtually 2 centuries ago. Well, he and Jenny, his wife, moved into Chelsea. Okay, nice leafy suburb, Chelsea these days. Go back 200 years, they moved out because of a cholera outbreak. Okay? So it was, in my way thinking about what London was like 2 centuries ago is pretty much what New Delhi was like 50 years ago. And therefore, you've got your tanning factories everywhere. There's raw sewage being pumped into the Thames. There's terrible working conditions. You find yourself being child labour, forced to work in factories, quite appalling conditions for the working class, actually compared to what they had when they were effectively feudal vassals. Many of them had a better situation when you had feudal rules constraining what could be taken off them by the lords compared to what happened with free enterprise capitalism. So that led to an enormous pressure for social change in the UK, in America, in Europe, and you had all sorts of revolutions taking place. Now that was to some extent kept outside the academia. The academics were still talking about how great capitalism is and the impetus for innovation, all of which are valid. Okay, but what it meant was the classical school in the universities was putting out pro-capitalist interpretation of classical economics, and Marx came out with an anti-capitalism interpretation of classical economics. And when it was published in 1867, it was almost instant that you had a shift from the classical school dominating the universities to the neoclassical school. And the neoclassical school said that value does not reflect effort, value reflects utility. It's the increase in utility that gives you an increase in value. It's not a case of exploiting workers, both workers and machinery is necessary for production, and it had a meritocratic interpretation of income rather than saying workers get paid a subsistence wage and the capitalist takes the remainder as a profit. The neoclassical theory says, well, the worker gets paid their marginal product, which is the addition they make to output. The capitalist gets paid their marginal product. It's all a meritocratic system. So that whole approach took over in the 1870s, and that's when the classical school is regarded as beginning. You can find neoclassical ideas right back in the late 1700s. It was like if we may have heard of Corno oligopoly theory. Well, Corno was writing at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th, so well before Jevons and Walras and Menger and Marshall gave us the neoclassical school. But they were the periphery. They were the people who were rubbished on the side. When the 1870s came, it completely flipped around. The classical school, this is the Marx, but also Ricardo, Smith, John Stuart Mill, all those people beforehand, their ideas got chucked out and the neoclassical school took over. And that's been dominant ever since the 1870s. It's changed its form in various ways, but the basic idea that that value is subjective, not objective, that it's marginal this and marginal that sets value, not gaps between use value and exchange value, which became Marx's logic. This stuff took all over in the 1870s, and we haven't gotten rid of it, despite the fact that it's. If I wanted to go through the logical contradictions that have been discovered by neoclassical economists, I'd take up 4 or 5 shows.
Yeah. So what we did there was a question about classical or neoclassical economics, and Steve could literally go on for days. We got a question though here, and this one I'll direct to Dirk. Do you think the ECB will go into negative rates anytime soon, Dirk?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the ECB has just decreased the interest rate again some days ago. And the reason is that the inflation rate is now less than 2% in the Eurozone, which is much lower than a little bit lower than the 2% target that they have. But it's falling. It's falling mostly because energy prices are falling. And there's a lot of room still to cut. So they still think that cutting interest rates will somehow revive the European economy. So if the inflation rate goes down some more, because maybe energy prices come down some more, then they would go further down. But I do not think that they go into negative rates I think that's not in the cards, especially because both on the European level there's this Draghi report, where Mario Draghi has said that in the Eurozone or in the European Union they should spend an extra 800 billion a year on mostly public investment and private investment. Some kind of combination. He was not too clear about where the money would be coming from. But even in the 2010s, where we had low growth rates and low inflation rates, the ECB did not really go negative. So I don't think that they would do it anytime soon. There would have to be a major rethink and also a major crisis in that sense. So, I mean, with the tariffs that are coming up, it seems like inflation rates, or at least imports, the prices of imports will go up. So this should be increasing inflation more than it will be decreasing inflation. So I don't think that the ECB will go into negative rates anytime soon.
We got another question here. This one I'll give to you, Steve, because we want to hear your opinion on Bitcoin. What do you think about Bitcoin, Steve? I know you've commented about it in the past. Give your best thoughts.
Look, I've got to say, I'm sorry I didn't take the advice from Max Kaiser and Stacey Herbert when I first heard about Bitcoin, because they actually were trying to persuade me to buy some when it was about $1, about £1 each, maybe 10 quid, I can't remember. And they explained me that the sticking point for me was when they explained that it took 10 minutes to close a transaction on the blockchain, because that whole idea was using large amounts of computing power to mean that it wasn't worth anybody's while to try to generate a false ledger, because the energy costs would be simply too high. So, but I thought 10 minutes to close a transaction, you can't go shopping for a cup of coffee and wait 10 minutes until it's verified that you are supposed to receive your cup of coffee. One of the things about money is it's instantly liquid, and that just didn't make sense to me. Now, I'm sorry I didn't buy them. Of course, I would have a multi-millionaire. I could have afforded to buy £1,000 worth, and God knows how many I would have had. But I feel a bit like Newton, in the sense that Newton saw the South Sea bubble happening when he ended up as one of the many roles he had. He was head of the English Mint, and he saw it happening, thought it was crazy, didn't get involved, saw it still going up, decided to buy in, and he bought in just before it crashed. So he got wiped out by the South Sea bubble bursting. So my feeling about it, it's a brilliant. Yeah, I know the Lightning exists. Okay, the Lightning network is there, but that doesn't write anything to the ledger, which sort of undermines the basic idea of an unbreakable ledger. You've got to have transactions occurring off it before they can be put on it. So the fact that it uses that amount of energy gave me two problems. One, I couldn't see how you can have a monetary system involving a 10-minute time delay before anything was fully recorded and fully transacted. And secondly, I thought, given what's happening with global warming, and I became more aware of that a few years later when I started reading the neoclassicals on global warming and realized how completely crazy their arguments were, that you didn't need to worry about it. So I thought at some point we're going to get to the stage where energy consumption is obviously realized as the problem. We're consuming too much energy. That's what's causing global warming. Therefore, at some point, we're going to have a serious crisis which kills lots of white people. It's not a serious crisis until white people die. You should be used to that by now with global politics. When that happens, the easiest way to reduce any consumption in a hurry is shut down Bitcoin, shut down international travel, and knock about 8% off our energy consumption overnight. So in a sense, I still expect that to happen. But when you've watched the monetary system, the current one we have, a credit-based fiat money system, and seeing the idiots who are in charge of it, this is all the neoclassical economists who run policy at the Federal Reserve and similar places, and the politicians and so on, totally mangling the private system, allowing far too much private debt to be created, not creating enough fiat money, worrying about government debt when private debt is the problem, et cetera, et cetera. We've got a total dog's breakfast as a financial system as a result of that. And maybe the fact that Bitcoin is a different dog's breakfast might mean that it bloody well succeeds. But the trouble with Bitcoin is this is comes back to the nature of money. When you look at how people define money, they say money is a means of exchange, a unit of count, and a store of value. Now, the first two make sense. Okay, obviously it's a means of exchange. We just went, we bought some chocolate. Okay? Chocolate. Here we go. Hang on. This is one of Dirk's favorite things. Hang on. There we go. Chocolate on bread. Okay. Sorry,
hold on. Is that do you spread that on with a knife, or do you just sprinkle it on?
Yeah, apparently.
Yes, you just sprinkle it on the bread.
Okay, we have I'm pretty sure you have it in Europe. We have Nutella, and it's like it's a chocolate spread.
Something like this.
Yes.
That's for peanut butter.
Okay. Now, why the hell we got that distraction there? Yeah, it's a means of exchange. You buy it straight away. Okay, it's a unit of count. That's fair. But a store of value. Okay? Money doesn't increase in value, and people, a lot of the negative attitudes to money from people who are gold freaks or Bitcoin freaks and so on, is to argue that it shouldn't change in value. Money should maintain its value, or preferably increase in value. Now, what that means is deflation. Okay, if money is increasing in value, goods are getting cheaper in money terms. And when you look at the history of deflation in the capitalist period, periods of deflation are periods of crisis. The reason being that you have levels of debt which are in nominal dollars, the price level falls, your debt burden rises. So it's actually a dangerous thing to have money that appreciates. Now, of course, Bitcoin has gone from being, I could have bought it for £1 each, I think, when I was first told about it by Max and Stacey, 2014, roughly. It's now 100,000. Okay. You'd be a bloody idiot to buy a pizza with a Bitcoin, wouldn't you? But we know historically there was a guy who bought a pizza for 10 or 20 Bitcoin. And now at 10 or 20 Bitcoin, he could buy the pizza company. And so the whole reason, the fact that it's such increasing in value so much, means that you don't want to use it for transactions. The only transactions you're going to use Bitcoin for are ones where you might get arrested if you use money. So it's good for money laundering, for black market operations, for countries that put restrictions on getting money out. You can use Bitcoin to get it out instead. All this stuff means that it's effective at it, but the main thing it's effective for is a major form of asset price inflation. It's the highest rate of increase of any asset over time, and that's why people buy into it. But it ain't money, because you don't want to spend it when it stabilizes.
Do you think that it's the modern equivalent of the Dutch tulip craze?
I think so, except you can do more with the Bitcoin than you could with tulips. I mean, some of the funny stuff about tulips, and I live in the tulip world now. This is Amsterdam here. Was that the tulips were, I think they were Turkish flower, and they were just, it was shipping them around between different countries at the time they turn up in the Netherlands, and people would buy them as sort of a status symbol. You put them in your flower bed outside and you see this nice little flower, and then they became an object of speculation. And ultimately, I think that the highest price that was paid for a Bitcoin was one horse carriage, and 2 houses to buy a tulip. Now, there were particular forms of tulips which were far more valuable than others. I've forgotten the actual name, but something Sempra was the most valuable. It turns out that with the Sempra colors turned up when the tulip was affected by a virus. And so you could actually buy a temper off somebody else, and the virus didn't get passed on, and you didn't get the bulb you thought you were buying. And the whole thing came crashing down. And that was the first major bubble that ever occurred in a capitalist economy, a speculative bubble. So I do see it as digital tulips.
Dirk, do you have anything you can add on about Bitcoin?
Yeah, well, I would agree that it is a highly speculative asset. So it's not really a currency. It's a point system. So there's a limited amount of points, just like in the monetary system. But the big difference is there's always demand for, let's say, dollars or euros, because people pay their taxes in those currencies and the government can force them to do so. But nobody can force you to make payments in Bitcoin. And there's very little contracts of debt in Bitcoin. So that means that the demand for Bitcoin can go towards zero. And the whole thing can really crash down from, let's say, $100,000 for a Bitcoin to, let's say, $10,000 for a Bitcoin. And of course, later it can go towards zero. But of course, getting the timing right is impossible, because this has become a crowd kind of thing. So just on financial markets, sometimes the whole market is irrational and people run off with some kind of asset. And I think John Maynard Keynes once said that the market can stay irrational longer than you can stay solvent. So I wouldn't bet on Bitcoin falling anytime soon. This can continue for a couple of years more. But there's nothing behind it in terms of a state contract. So the money that we're using, like the US dollar and the euro, is backed by the state, which demands it for payment of taxes. So that is the so-called charterist school. And there's no charter behind Bitcoin, as I explained, and that is the dangerous thing. That people just are just buying it because they think they can find somebody else they can sell it to that person for a higher price, and that seems to be the only thing that is driving it.
Everybody, make sure you get your questions in the chat for either Dirk or Steve or both, or maybe me if you care. We do have another question. I mean, like, if you care about me, but I'm suspecting I'm the third rung on the tier in this conversation, which I'm fine. I'm fine with. You know, I'm talking with two of the greats, in my opinion. We have a question here for Steve, which my model might actually kind of address. At Steve Keen, where can we find your most advanced integrated model of government money and credit creation and its implications for the job market and inflation? Thank you, and Dirk, for the great work. Steve. I can't hear you, Steve.
Okay. Strangely enough, I have to remember this bloke called Ty Keynes for that, because well, let's bring up your model on screen, Ty.
Okay.
Okay.
I gotta coordinate this with myself here.
You'll get this. So I'll chat while you coordinate, okay? And you can get my ugly visage off and show your model at the time. But what I've built, my initial work was to take a model of, here we go. This is Ty's model here, turning up in a moment. So I built a sort of conceptual models of a private sector economy with debt and government spending, and then I included the role of energy inside there and a range of different elements like that. And Ty took that model and integrated all those various elements together. So if you can actually make it the full scale, Ty, just make it the full screen so we can see the whole. I know it's huge, but okay. Just give an idea of the complexity.
So yeah, here we go. So this actually model has now been converted into a quantitative model for the US, but this was an old draft model. I always consider a Ravel-Minsky like your drafting board for modeling, and then you can take that model and apply it however you want to do. But when I start this model, obviously most people know I'm definitely on the post-Keynesian side of things. I definitely have a strong interest for, stock flow consistent modeling, obviously some MMT in there. But this is where you can take your modeling with different godly tables, right? So your godly table is a balance sheet. It lists your assets, it lists your liabilities. So you have in your columns, those are your stocks, or you can call them accumulators, you can call them levels. In economics, we generally call them stocks. And then your rows are the flows that go in and out of the stocks. Now, you can have one godly table, but you can also interlock your godly table. So you can have multiple sectors. So you can have a household sector, and you can have your banking sector, and obviously the banking sector, because you have exchange between different sectors facilitated by banks. Their godly table or balance sheet is going to be a little bit larger, right? You can have a monetary authority. In this basic model, the monetary authority didn't do much. It basically had its settlement balances or reserves, as you call them in the US, and your TGA, your government account, and what assets the central bank holds. You have a fiscal authority, that does its transactions between the private sector, facilitated by settlement balances going between banks and the TGA. And so essentially this specific model run that I have built is Steve's debt deflation model just on steroids, where you can see inflation, you can see the different components of GDP, you can see your private and public debt ratios, you can see output in the model. You can see your shares of income throughout the economy between each sector. You have multiple interest rates, whether it's for bond yields, for commercial lending rates, or the interbank rate for the American viewers. That's your effective Fed funds rate. You have your total deposits, and then you have your reserves in the model. You can run this live. This is like a sandbox version of a general capitalist economy, right? So if I want to maybe increase government spending, increase direct household payments from the government. So we'll do some deficit spending here, right? And you can look at the nonlinear effects of what will happen. And with system dynamics, so we all have mental models. It doesn't matter what school you're from, if you're an Austrian, you're an MMT, or you're post-Keynesian, you're neoclassical, we all have our mental models. And those are great and all for basic concepts. But the next step to your mental model is formalizing it with equations, right? And when you do that, especially with nonlinear modeling, you're going to experience some emergent behaviors in your model, some insights that you didn't expect, because these are nonlinear equations interacting with each other. And so you can, with Minsky, you can break down your model into different sectors, right? So this is the firm share of income for gross domestic income. So the debt, the level of debt and the flow of credit, your equity and assets. You can look at each sector, right, to see how, each one's performing. And there's no specific way you have to do this. It's to the modeler's desires, how they want to lay out a model. And the heart of everything is your equations on the canvas itself. So Steve was showing a Goodwin Keen Minsky model earlier. Steve had one of my favorite papers from him is actually his PhD thesis, where he really expanded the Goodwin growth cycle model. So he had functions for capital utilizations, functions for productivity, right? And he interlocked it all together. And so I used that thesis as one of the core parts of my model. So this is the firm sector. Essentially, he was modeling the firm sector. In that model, he was just constrained to that. He didn't address, I don't think he addressed government spending at the time, but Steve has addressed all those things, whether it's government spending, capitalist spending, so high income earning households. So you can define your equations for high income earners or capitalists, right? You can define your equations for the government, the monetary authority or central bank, your price inflation equations, your foreign trade, right? And you can lay it out in Minsky any way you want for, just keeping your model all ordered. And the final thing I'll say about system dynamics is these are all endogenous effects that are happening. It's never going to go around equilibrium. So in system dynamics, you have repellers and attractors. So you can think of those as your equilibrium points. And so there could be aperiodic cycles around it or non-periodic cycles that will repel it and then attract it. And you can have multiple points in your system, right? And then you get these nonlinear dynamics. And so this model, I'm not making these business cycles. These business cycles are a result of the model structure itself based on, some theory. So that's where you can really use Minsky. Like if you're an MMTer, great, you've got your godly tables, right? So you can do your stock flow consistent. I like to say stock flow accounting consistent modeling. because we're looking at the assets and the liabilities and then figuring out the equity, right? But if you're more into the mathy type stuff, you can do your raw equations, and of course you're working in ordinary differential equations, not difference equations. Steve can go on a little bit more about that. But yeah, that's kind of where you can take that. And of course, we built out this model specifically for the US economy. We'll probably be putting out a free online interface soon. It's just a lot of work. And I will attempt to stop sharing my screen. Stop sharing. Can I bring you guys back? You guys are back. That is Minsky Ravel on steroids, I would say.
And that's with applied MMT. So if we actually want to show that website, because this is now a collaboration between you and Doug, as a way of being able to not to say which particular stocks to buy, but to say when to get in and when to get out of different assets.
So we actually, we've got the two sites. So we've got applied MMT, which is a retail version. So any retail customers that are interested in our tools and where the broad direction of where markets are going to go, we don't advocate stock picking. So if day trading's your thing, we don't have any tools for that, and it's that's all technical science. Some people are really good at it, and most people lose their shirts at it. So we're more of a investing, directional investment type tools. And then we've got applied MMT is applied modern macro technologies. Yes, it's a play on MMT. Doug is a huge fan of Warren Mosler, right? So and Adam, so that kind of all play together. But the MMT is modern macro technologies. Then we have more of an institutional side, which is modern macro technologies, and we're building out an interface. And we will have some sort of a free version so people can use that sandbox model that I was just showing to kind of test out different policy choices. What does raising interest rates really do during an economic boom versus raising them, let's say, during a slump? What does direct household payments from the government, deficit spending payments do versus government spending into firms, right? And of course, I can go off on the importance of private sector firms doing capital investment and having the government give them grants for that, deficit spending grants, which I think is a very powerful thing. And I think Dirk might agree that we need a little bit of that in Germany right now, some capital investment in the private sector. But yeah, that's the type of stuff you can do with Ravel. I encourage everybody to download it. It doesn't matter what your skill set is. Even if you're just a beginner, you can just plug in those godly tables and just look at your stock flow consistency. Does the government spend before it taxes? Well, you can prove that using those godly tables, right? And make it as elaborative as you want. If you've got an engineering background, well, you can do your ordinary differential equations and build little nonlinear systems. It doesn't even have to be for economics. It could be a predator-prey model, a pandemic model, many, many different things. Steve?
Yeah. What I find incredibly frustrating. A second, forgot the other thing. I'm just making sure my audio works. What I find incredibly frustrating is that one of the most dominant questions on the planet is what's going to happen because of the money system. And everybody who's using it, attempting to answer that, is doing it without having a way of understanding the financial transactions that actually give us the monetary system. So when I first invented Minsky, it was specifically to be able to handle money and show the double entry bookkeeping behind it. And when you look at the double entry bookkeeping, the panic that people have about the government going bankrupt is a product of believing that the banks are intermediaries who don't create money. As soon as you see that they are money creators, then creating debt also creates money. And rather than getting a runaway level of debt compared to GDP, the rising level of debt actually brings up the level of GDP as well, whether that's coming from the private sector or from the government. So the dynamics are completely different. So when you get it right, you realize that people who are panicking about the government running out of money, the bank going bankrupt, too much government debt, et cetera, are basically worrying about epicycles and a whole model of the economy. Okay, they've got an Earth-centric model with a flat Earth, in terms of the economy that they're not even aware they've got. And so Ravel is, in that sense, it's absolutely critical that people have a look at it, look at the logic themselves, see that when you have governments creating money by running a deficit, then as well as an increasing level of government debt, you've got an increasing amount of money, which we then use for commerce in the private sector. And without that government money, you wouldn't get the level of economic activity that we have. You can have the government doing the wrong thing. I don't think bombing the shit out of Israel or the shit out of Ukraine is a good use of government money. That's the main sort of thing politicians will easily use their money for. I'd rather see health and education and infrastructure being created, so that all is what we should be doing. But instead of that, we're obsessing about the government deficit itself, when the deficit is how the government creates money. So yeah, it's absolutely vital to learn how to use Ravel. But of course, so few people do.
So we got another question here from Landon, and I'll actually get Dirk to answer it first, even though it's directed at Steve. Have you heard, I have heard you mention, Kalecki, what parts of Marxism do you apply to your post-Keynesian Minsky framework? I know that's not quite directed at you, Dirk, but I'm sure you can give some insight there before we get Steve to answer.
Yeah, I think one of the main insights of Kalecki is that he said that full employment is something which the capitalist sector will resist. So even if you have a government that is pursuing a full employment strategy and that works, it might be politically unstable. So you have to think about the institutions in your society, which would enable to have a policy of full employment, which is politically stable. I mean, what we have seen in the post-World War II era was kind of stable capitalism, where countries did pursue full employment policies. They did so successfully. I know the numbers for Germany at the end of the 1960s. Unemployment or full employment was defined as an unemployment rate of less than 0.8%. So let me just repeat that. That was full employment. And in the end of the 60s, the German government achieved this goal for a couple of years in a row. And the inflation rate was between 1.5 and 3% at the time. So this myth of the Phillips curve, that you have to pick either a full employment, high inflation environment or a low inflation, high unemployment environment, that came later, and that was used to disrupt this kind of Keynesian consensus. So I'm pretty sure that this part of Kalecki is what we apply in the post-Keynesian discussions as well. But I'm sure that Steve has something to add to that.
Steve?
Yeah, I'm a critic of. there's not a branch of economic theory that I haven't been a critic of. A bit of make me a difficult little bastard to have in your think tank. So my first thing was criticizing the labor theory of value, because I read Marx in a leftist workshop after a set of student strikes in Sydney in 1973, and everybody else wanted to become more Marxist. I just couldn't swallow the argument the machines didn't add value. So I wanted to see a damn good explanation by Marx as to why that was the case. And what I found instead was a good explanation to Marx of why it wasn't the case. In other words, he found a logical contradiction of his arguments about the source of value when he developed a philosophy, a dialectical explanation for where value comes from. And that ended up turning up, undermining the labor theory of value. But he got, when he did that, that meant he could no longer argue that socialism was inevitable, and that was just too much of a intellectual shift for Marx to handle. So he managed to mangle his own philosophy to end up still supporting the idea that socialism was inevitable. So I see that as a major error in Marx's thinking. But so many brilliant insights came out of Marx. For example, probably the most useful one that we didn't get into Keynesian economics was his distinction between what he called circuits of capital. So he said there's a circuit of capital which involves having a commodity, selling it for money, and getting a different commodity. And that's pretty much what workers do. You have labor, which you can't You can't use your own labor. You've got to work for an employer to make it into something valuable. You sell your labor to an employer. You then produce goods for that, which the employer then sells, and then you get a wage and you can buy the commodities to stay alive. That's the CMC circuit. Now, on that one, Marx said that pretty much demand creates supply. Okay, it was a supply creates demand. It was the classic idea of Say's law, that you get equilibrium out of that system. But he said there's another circuit which he called MCM plus, and that is you start with a certain amount of money, you buy commodities with that, and you sell them for more money. Now, he said that is not a circuit that leads to equilibrium. That circuit only applies if in fact, the M dashed at the end is greater than the M at the start. You make money out of it. That's the circuit of industrial capital. And he said that's the volatile circuit. That's the part that causes booms and busts. And that was what Keynes, in some ways, Keynes actually accepted that. And so that was a great argument. And he wrote it in a draft of the general theory in 1933. And then when it came to publishing the general theory in 1936, by this stage, Stalin was far more dominant. There was worries about the socialist revolution in America, to some extent Britain, but mainly America. So Keynes sort of knew that it would be on the nose to quote Marx. So he removed that whole argument about CMC and MCM plus, which he said was brilliant when he first saw it. And he substituted and said what he called D1 and D2, where D1 was dependent upon income and D2 demand wasn't dependent upon income. Totally incomprehensible. So in that sense, Marx gave a better argument for sources of instability in a capitalist economy than Keynes himself did. Marx also worked out the idea of input-output dynamics. So he talked about you needed to have multi-sectoral production to produce multi-sectoral output. So consumption goods required investment goods required consumption goods. You got input-output dynamics. That was Marx's innovation. So there's so many brilliant ideas that first came up in Marx. So in that sense, virtually any non-orthodox theory is using Marx to some degree, whether they know it or not. Koleski was an engineer, Polish engineer, and of course, coming across to England when he did after the collapse of the 1920s boom. He applied engineering concepts, but he'd also learned Marx's ideas. And a huge part of post-Keynesian economics is based on Koleski's concept. So Koleski is absolutely crucial, again, often without people knowing that they're using Koleskian ideas. But Koleski in some ways, gave us the foundations of stock flow consistent modeling. In fact, people probably know the joke, this joke, Ty, but one day Koleski turned up for lunch with Nicky Haldor and Joan Robinson, and before he sat down said, I've worked out what economics is. It's the science of confusing stocks and flows. And so he was rabid about the need to get the balances right, to get your accounting done properly, and he ended up, in some ways, Koleski is the foundation of what we call post-Keynesian economics. So Koleski is massively influential for me. He gave great arguments on exports and imports as well, which happen to contradict what modern monetary theory says these days on that front. But yeah, Koleski is the fountainhead in that sense of what we call post-Keynesian economics.
Yeah, he's definitely top 5 for me, up there with Joan Robertson, John Galbraith, obviously Keynes. He's influential even in that model I showed you, right? That's, fundamentally the price level equation is kind of derived from his work with firms wanting a constant markup, that sort of stuff. There is I just want to clarify here. Where was it? I don't see it anymore. Oh yeah, here it is. If you could clarify this question for me, my model does include, debt and credit for all the different sectors. Obviously, you are right. If I'm not including debt, it invalidates my model. Let's just clarify what big debt is. We got a fun question next for you, Steve, and Dirk. You can play into it as well. Steve, are you a fan of the gold standard?
The one gold standard I agree with is one that my brilliant old lecturer Ted Wheelwright said, and he said that there's two elements. He said the golden rule is he who has the gold makes the rules. And the second was when you think you need gold, you need lead more. So if you look at the history of gold, and this is where David Graeber did absolutely critically essential work. David said, if you look at the history of when gold was money, so gold was used as actual, people were paid in gold and would buy in gold or buy in silver, it was always during periods of social breakdown. So you had, I mean, the most warlike continent on the planet is Europe. Okay, Europe's had longer wars and more wars than any other continent. And there were the 100 Years' War, the 30 Years' War, the War of the Roses, etc., etc. In those situations, the wars were ultimately fought by mercenaries, not by loyalists, but the major part of the forces were mercenaries. And the mercenaries would not accept payment in the king's coin because the king could lose. So if the king loses, you get paid in something worthless. So if you're going to go into battle, you insisted on being paid in either gold or silver. So in those periods of social breakdown, that's when gold and silver became money. But fundamentally, what money has always been is a promise. And to have promises accepted to enable transactions in goods, you have to have promises everybody trusts. And trust, again, is something which involves a functional society. It doesn't involve one where you've got a war with a neighboring feudal state and you're about to be potentially wiped out in the next battle. So gold, no, the gold, if gold becomes the standard, we're going to end up where lead's actually the standard.
Dirk, how about you? Are you a gold standard type of guy?
No, I think the gold standard is a big misunderstanding because we had many different gold standards in our history. And there's many misunderstandings. Let me just point out three of them. First of all, there was never the possibility of Americans, for example, to go to the Fed and to swap dollars for actual gold. So the gold window was open only for foreign central banks. It was never open for households or companies. And that is something which, of course, takes a lot of fun away, because if you claim that you could always go to the central bank and exchange your paper currency for gold, and that therefore the currency would be backed by gold, it was not the case domestically. So for Americans, that never worked. So that was only for foreigners. And second myth is that the gold standard, it worked, but it worked until there was a crisis, and then it stopped to work. So when the First World War broke out, for example, you should normally have the same gold price everywhere, but that wasn't happening because the Germans, they had submarines, and it was not possible for England, for example, to send boats with gold to, let's say, Canada to pay for Canadian imports, because there was a danger of submarines. And Lloyd's of London would not insure those freighters which were carrying the gold and silver. So that meant that you had big differences in the prices of gold and silver, and they were not arbitraged away because there was risk involved. So every time there was a crisis, the gold standard was suspended in practice. It's a little bit like the European Union always suspends the rules of the Stability and Growth Pact when there is a crisis. And the third thing that I would like to mention when it comes to the gold standard is that it was broken up by Nixon, and when he broke it up, everybody thought that the world will end. When we go from fixed exchange rates to flexible exchange rates, everybody thought that this will be a really big shock to the world economy. But that's not what happened. So from 1970, I think 71 or 72 is when it happened, the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system. It was dissolved a little bit slowly. In the back, there was the French tried to convert their US dollar holdings into gold because they delivered a lot of goods, and mostly goods, to the US, which the US needed either directly for the Vietnam War or to import consumer goods so that they could use workers to produce war production. And when the French threatened the American government to get the gold, it was a bit strange. I don't understand it until this day why Nixon decided to close the gold window. He could have just said to the French government, look, we protect Europe against the communists with our nuclear weapons. France has some too, but it's a couple of hundreds. The Americans had thousands. So it's part of a deal, okay? So we protect you in Europe, and you leave your dollars where they are. I mean, when you look at what Trump is doing with the terrorists and everything, I think it's pretty clear that Nixon could have done the same. He could have bullied the French into not taking the gold. But when it happened again, the gold standard collapsed and nothing really happened. On the other hand, in the 19th century, when the United States was on a gold standard, we already had a Great Depression in the 19th century, which went on for more than a decade with deflation, with mass unemployment. And the reason why the modern central banks were created, including the Federal Reserve Bank, was that the gold standard didn't work. It created deflation, it created mass unemployment and financial crisis. And that is why they created modern central banks to manage the economy better than the gold standard. And we never went back. Not a single country went back to a gold standard. And I think that means a lot.
Thanks, Dirk. I appreciate the detailed answer there. You can post your question just like you posted it right there. So if it's a good enough question, like a lot of people have questions, I'm trying to highlight the ones that are good. So just post your question wherever you're at. If you're on X, post it there. If you're on YouTube, post it there. I got a hard-hitting question next here, and we can both get you to do it. I'll lead off with Steve. It's a hard-hitting one. Steve, does MMT suggest the elimination of wage, labor, and ownership as a means of production? If not, why would workers, Marxists, get behind it if capitalists will still control the economy? Steve, you go first.
Well, part of it is that when you look at what happens when governments get obsessed with austerity and cutting out their deficits, that means they stop spending on social services. And of course, we know that the people who mainly consume social services are the billionaires. They're the ones who line up at the hospitals because they can't afford to pay for medical services. They're the ones who hop on trains because they can't afford Rolls Royces, etc., etc. In other words, the working class are the ones who benefit from those elements, and that's what austerity cuts out. So when you have austerity, it doesn't mean Rupert Murdoch can't get medical treatment anyway. It can go and buy a bloody hospital if he wants to, let alone paying for the treatment. So the rich don't suffer when government spending gets cut, but the poor do. So in that sense, even if there's no elimination of wage labour and no change in ownership of means of production, what MMT says is the government should be spending on welfare, the government should be spending on health, and when it does, it both provides services that working class can't afford. You'd have to redistribute income in the capitalist economy to enable that to happen from capitalists to workers. And of course, that happens every day of the bloody week. No, it doesn't. But instead, the government can make up for the insufficient incomes that workers receive. That means they can actually get the long-term health, the education, the transportation. So MMT means that you would have a more sensible approach. So the government should spend to create those services. The working class, the poor, benefit from it. And so what we've got the worst of both worlds right now. We've got wage labor, we've got ownership of the means of production, but we don't get the provision of social services, which the state should be providing and can provide let alone without causing a crisis for capitalism, but enabling a more successful version of capitalism to occur. So in that sense, MMT is a precursor to the other issues. And if you have a decent welfare system and decent provision of infrastructure and so on, then you have a better functioning capitalist economy and workers don't starve to death at the same time. So I can understand why there's such support for MMT, because we can see the government shooting itself in the foot all the damn time and undermining capitalism in the process.
Dirk, do you want to add anything onto that? Not really. I mean, Steve covered all the bases here. Okay. I mean, MMT is an analytical lens. So in that sense, it opens up a lot of policy space, and what Steve described is just what is possible with an MMT lens, that you have a lot of, as Keynes called it, socialization of investment. But of course, you could also think about an economy where you have no more wage labor. But you would have a universal basic income, for example. So also that would be possible to do with MMT. But I agree with Steve that both of the policy advice that comes from the MMT camp goes into this direction, that we need a bigger welfare state and that we need to definancialize the economy.
All right. Well, we got another hard-hitting one. I'll direct it to you first, Dirk. It is from Cooper Power. How can MMT maintain itself in an era where debt is increasing at a faster rate than the growth in GDP, and not only the first order growth, but the second order where the acceleration is increasing? Dirk.
Let me rephrase the question. How can the theory of gravity maintain itself in a situation where a comet is flying towards the Earth and it's going to hit us? Yeah, well, I mean, MMT is a description of the real world. It's an analysis of how the monetary system works. So nobody in the MMT camp says that it's a good idea to increase debt faster than GDP. Nobody says that it's a bad idea. Mainly, it's an analysis of what that means. So you could also rephrase the question and ask, how can MMT maintain itself in an era where private wealth, private monetary wealth or private financial wealth is increasing at a faster rate than the growth of GDP? So normally, when the government spends lots of money, even if it spends it in a way that the rich benefit more than the poor, then the rich at some point will start to spend that money, increase GDP, and by that also increase tax revenue, so that both GDP is growing and the deficit is falling. So I don't think, for example, that you can have a public debt to GDP ratio on this planet which is above, let's say, 500% of GDP. Japan was at 250% of GDP for a while, and Greece was over 200%. And we have countries which have a lot of inequality, like Brazil, but normally you don't see this kind of high public debt to GDP ratio. And since the government cannot run out of money, there's no technical problem involved. Of course, it points out to a situation where probably the society is very unjust. So probably a wealthy elite, an oligarchy, receives a lot of income from government contracts. I mean, Elon Musk comes to mind, whereas the working class gets very little of the extra money that has been spent. And of course, then you would have a situation where you have an increase in public debt and very little increase in GDP. So I think that MMT is still the best analytic instrument to look at the economy and to understand what's going on and what are the pressing issues. So there's no pressing issue in the sense that the US government will run out of money or not make payments. The issue is that the way that the economy or the economic system is set up in the US, it's very unequal, so that the rich benefit and that, again, the working class mostly has a big problem, not getting enough, which makes it an unfair society.
Nice. Steve, we got one here for you. From the Minstrel, Professor Steve, does a sovereign country that can spend to maximize domestic resources have to accumulate foreign exchange reserves? Steve.
Can spend. This is one of the arguments I get back when I'm fighting MMT on the point of MMT that I completely disagree with, and that's their analysis of foreign trade. So the argument I often get is that the MMT line, and it's, to me, it's not part of the account. It's not based on the accounting concepts of MMT, which I'm 100% in support of. It's a little saying: exports are a cost, imports are a benefit, and that says that therefore the government, a trade deficit, if you're running a trade deficit, that can be countered by government spending more. So then you have a decline in employment or a decline in income levels courtesy of a trade deficit. The government can counteract by running a government deficit. You don't need to have the foreign resources. Now, when I do the accounting, and I'm working on this as a very large paper I'll be hopefully releasing in about a year's time, but the basic point is that, yes, it's true that the government creates money by spending more than it takes back in taxation. It's also true that exports create money by transferring foreign reserves as assets of one country to foreign reserves of assets in another country. So if you're running a deficit in the trade, you can make up by having a government deficit. And how many countries on the planet do that? At the moment, precisely one, most likely China. Every other country is obsessed with getting its government deficit down, and they're also ignoring the trade deficit. To me, the trade deficit is the main thing you want to minimize, and that's why I'm a fan of Keynes's idea of a Bancor to avoid major trade imbalances. So it can be true that a government doesn't have to accumulate foreign exchange reserves to be able to create money for itself. But most countries are not doing enough to maximize domestic resources. That's the whole idea of a sovereign country maximizing domestic resources is a government that's doing the right thing by MMT. Now, as I said, I think there's about one country on the planet that's doing that, and that's China. Everybody else is not doing it. So in that situation, if you're in a country, if you're a producer in a country stupid enough not to be managing government finances properly by creating a deficit and therefore creating fiat money, you can compensate for that by export sales. And so a huge reason why the country I'm in right now, Netherlands, has the quality of resources it has, the quality infrastructure and the quality of life, it's running an 8% of GDP trade surplus. Okay. So its country is trying to run have a zero deficit or less than zero. They're trying to pay government debt down. That's destroying money, but the Netherlands is compensating by creating money through an export surplus. So yeah, I think it's a question that shows that this argument of MMT, it's a silly idea, guys. I'm sorry. I'm not going to treat it with respect. I treat neoclassical nonsense with a lack of respect. I'll do the same stuff with the MMT that I regard as silly, same way I did for Marx. So yes, I'm going to make some enemies. Great. I'm not worried about that one iota. I'm more worried about making logical errors.
Hey, this is great. We want this. This is the important thing, is we're able to discuss our differences in opinion. Obviously, economics is very diverse with many different schools and many different ideologies, many different analysis techniques to analyze the economy. So there's going to be those differences, and I think it's healthy if we can do it in a respectable way to a degree, to make sure we're highlighting these differences, because if there are gaps, then that means there are unknowns, and we need to explore those. Dirk, I've got one here for you. Might be another hard-hitting one. I'm not too sure. What do we have here? I can't read your name, sorry, but I'm glad you posted the question. How does MMT propose to manage inflation risk when the economy reaches full productive capacity? Dirk, go ahead on that one.
Okay, that's a problem we didn't have for half a century. Yeah, but it's a good one. So I think the first thing that we would see is that we have automatic stabilizers built into the economy. So if we are going towards full productive capacity, let's assume that there is wage pressure in the economy. I doubt it, because in many countries the unions are very weak. In Belgium, for example, they are strong. So half of the people, half of the workers are union members, and there's lots of strikes. So if you have a country where there are strong unions and you have a pressure on the side of labor, then of course, if prices do increase because the firms pass on the higher wages by increasing their prices, then of course there will be higher tax payments, because people will make more money, and the more nominal income you have, the higher your average tax rate and your marginal tax rate will be. So to some extent, there's automatic stabilizers at work. And this means that during the boom, we normally never get to the situation where the inflation rate somehow spins out of control. So if you go back in time, just before COVID, for example, in the US, the inflation rate was ticking up just a little bit. In the Eurozone, it was ticking up just a little bit, but it didn't get out of control. So this idea that when demand increases and then output increases and the labor market is tightening, that then we would have inflation. I think that's this kind of Phillips curve idea, that this would happen, but there's very little empirical evidence that this actually would happen. So I would say, from an MMT perspective, look at the bottlenecks when it comes to labor, for example. Look at the bottlenecks when it comes to inputs from foreign countries. Look at energy creation, for example. looking at also the solar panels as domestic supply, but also the imported energy from fossil fuels. I think those are the main risks when it comes to inflation. I don't think that you should manage demand in that sense to decrease inflation. Just to give you an idea, in 2024, a lot of countries had been asked a year prior to reduce government spending in 2024 because of the high rates of inflation. Many European countries did that, Germany included. It didn't work. So the inflation rate was the same in other countries where they did not cut. So I don't think that aggregate demand has a direct influence on the rate of inflation. Everything is more driven by costs, and the main costs in our times are normally energy and labor costs, unit labor costs, but also from an MMT perspective, the cost that the public sector works, because that is sustainable. Of course, when looking forward, also there could be shortages in raw materials, which means that there might be cost push inflation from imported stuff like cocoa beans or other things. I mean, cocoa beans is just too small to really lead to inflation, but you could see that, for example, in the United States, there was a lot of debate about the price of eggs, which probably also did not drive the inflation rate, but it's part of a wider phenomenon that if we have more and more problems with managing agriculture, managing resources like raw materials, then of course it's possible that with bad weather conditions and changes in the climate, and I mean these two are combined then for situations where you have a hot summer and then the yield of agriculture is very low, then of course you can also have problems from this side. And of course, when it comes to these problems, there's nothing you can do with the monetary system. It's just that there's less goods and services around because there's less agricultural productivity. There's nothing we could do about it. So the things that we can affect is wages, and also the whole structure of income and wealth. So if you want to bring down, for example, emissions of CO2, you should try to ensure that the rich have less money. You should also maybe outlaw certain goods, consumer goods, that they cannot be consumed. So yeah, I mean, many goods and services which we have in the consumer basket are goods and services which we shouldn't have in our economy because they waste too many resources. And then, of course, if you would just basically remove them from the basket, then of course you would also remove their influence on inflation. So yeah, so from an MMT perspective, it's about managing the worker relations, the wages, and mostly the energy. I think that would be the main topic. The central bank can do much about those things.
Right. Great stuff. Sam, glad you're here from Twitter. I completely agree with your comment. We definitely let's learn how money works. MMT provides that to its core. I 100% agree. So even if we have disagreements, beyond that, if we're speaking in the same language, we can start closing those gaps. Sam and we often have lots of conversations on X. Sometimes we agree on things, sometimes we don't, but we generally are speaking the same language. Steve, I got a question here for you. Maybe it's an easy one for you. Does higher wages and people having more money cause the price of everything to go up? Inflation.
In fact, when you take a look at where inflation comes from, the standard neoclassical argument and the Austrian argument is money causes inflation. So as soon as you talk about money growth, wham, somebody says Weimar. I actually think we should stop talking about a Pavlovian response and start talking about an Austrian response. Mention the word, mention money growth, bang, an Austrian says inflation. When you take a look at the data, what actually causes inflation tends to be struggles over the distribution of income. Workers will demand wage rises. To pay those wage rises, firms have lines of credit, and they can, with the banks, if the wage negotiating comes out and there's an increase in the price level or the wage level, then the firms get the money by accessing effectively their credit cards. So the money growth is caused by the inflation. You have a struggle over the distribution of income, leads to an increase in wages. The wages have to be paid. They're paid by borrowing money from the banking sector. The loans have already been negotiated. So the increase in money is caused by the inflation, not the other way around. It reverses the causation that Milton Friedman fantasized about where, of course, in Milton Friedman's analysis, he left out the existence of private banks. Now, leaving out private banks and saying you're analysing capitalism is like taking wings off birds and saying you're analysing flight. So it's the wrong way around. So distribution of income causes increase in the amount of money. It's the battle over distribution of income that causes inflation in the first place. Again, this comes back to Kalecki's pricing equation. Like virtually everything else that Kalecki did, he derived it from first principles. And he said, what's your price level? Well, price level is going to be your markup on costs. And he broke costs down into per unit costs, cost of production, the wage per unit, and the markup put on each unit. And you therefore have three sources of inflation, fundamentally. Workers can get wage rises when there's high levels of employment. That causes the money price to go up. Labour productivity, output per worker, normally rises, but that can actually go into reverse if you have, say, energy shortages or increases in energy costs. So that can cause a change in the price level. And then firms can change markups. And that when you decompose it, you find the dominant source of inflation over time has actually been firms putting up markups in response to workers getting higher money wages. And then the deflation we experienced, relative fall in the price level, has largely come out of relocating production to a globalized economy and reducing per unit cost that way. So inflation tends to be something about the distribution of income. The money system responds to it. Money is not a constraint, it's an enabler. And that's what people get wrong. So yes, higher wages play a role, definitely. So do higher markups, and so do falls in labour productivity. But the money system accommodates all that. It doesn't constrain it.
All right, great stuff, Steve. I've got one now for Dirk, and I'm going to nuance it first. And then, Dirk, I want you to maybe disagree with my assessment or agree on my assessment, and then answer the person's question directly. What MMT and money printing ultimately produce is more and more rich people. Now, for one, I want to nuance this, and I'll let Dirk take over. This isn't an MMT thing. This, in my eyes, I do agree. It does help rich people because we have government bonds. So the way we offset our deficits are with financial instruments that tend to end up in the hands of wealthier people who then earn an interest income from it. So it's not necessarily an MMT thing, not at all. It's a structural thing of our economy. MMT would describe it, but it's not MMT money printing. Dirk, what do you think about that, and how would you counter it, per se?
Yeah, well, I would first point out that MMT as an analysis, it's a tool to understand the economy, and it is not an economic policy proposal. So, of course, the monetary system existed for centuries, and MMT is relatively new, so it was created in roughly in the 1990s and developed from there. So basically, yeah, we had a lot of inequality, for example, in the early 20th century. Or late 19th century also. I mean, the life expectancy in Liverpool in 1900, I think, was 19 years because so many people died young when they were working in the factories, and they had a 12-hour day and they worked 6 days a week, sometimes more. So what MMT does, it helps you to understand what's going on, and it helps you to understand that the government's really powerful because they can make those payments, and it's important to understand that there's no limit to these payments, and that means that you really have to be careful, especially when you bail out the banks, for example. So if you bail out the banks, like the United States did and other countries did in 2007, 2008, then of course you basically give money to institutions, capitalist institutions that have lost billions, and it can be perceived as unfair, and that is not, I mean, you are redistributing purchasing power when you do that. So people who would have lost everything when you would have played according to the rules, they were made good. And Obama, for example, did not bail out the American workers who were falling behind on their mortgages. Instead, he bailed out the banks. So millions of Americans were evicted from their homes, and the homes were auctioned off to the highest bidder. And then the financial sector got in and bought these real estate. They bought the real estate cheap and they sold it on later for a higher price. So it's politics which basically determines how you use the power of the state. Jamie Galbraith has a very nice book called The Predator State, I think from 2009, where he describes that neoliberalism did not say that they want to reduce the state or spend less, but they were capturing the state and they were making sure that the state paid money so they could get rents from government spending. And especially the bailout following the financial crisis was a very big redistribution of income and wealth from poor to rich. And this is also what has created, I think, the whole MAGA movement, Make America Great Again, because they did not care about the industrial sector jobs. They said it would be okay to import from China. And everybody thought, well, yes, it does. I mean, the United States lost 1 in 3 manufacturing sector jobs in the 2000s, and no politician was talking about that. And then the global financial crisis happened, and many people who were working class, they also lost then their house or their flat because of the financial crisis. And that, of course, created lots of anger, lots of frustration, and it was not addressed properly in politics, not by the Republican Party, not by the Democratic Party. And I think that enabled Donald Trump to jump into this gap, to basically ride on the wave of working class anger. So MMT helps to show to people what has happened here, how has the power of the purse of the state been used, and what alternatives were there, and also why have these alternatives not been used. For example, Larry Summers was very influential during the administration of Obama, always arguing that you shouldn't use fiscal policy, but you should use monetary policy. So he was arguing for lower interest rates, also to control the rate of inflation. And of course, these new Keynesian policies, they are the establishment's policy mix when it comes to fiscal and monetary policy. And if you don't like the results of the redistribution of income from poor to rich in the last, let's say, 20, 30 years, well, that's the new Keynesian policies that did it. That's not MMT.
Great stuff. Just some housekeeping, everybody. We got to make sure we can keep this live stream going. So the situation is Steve has really accelerated the growth in his YouTube channel with some really punchy, short, high impact YouTube videos that get hundreds of thousands of views. So if you're watching this and you need to step away, keep the live stream running. We're trying to, get the algorithm on our side. If you leave, it shows that you're disinterested in the stream itself, and it kind of messes with the algorithm. And our concern is that could affect Steve's high performing videos. So just think about that when you're watching on YouTube. Doesn't matter so much on Twitter X. And make sure you hit the like button. Make sure you subscribe to the Prof. Steve Keen YouTube channel. Steve, I have one on the Bancor, so we might as well do it. Would Keynes' banker system be more or less profitable for the capitalist class than the current system? Steve?
I think it'd be more profitable, and this is one of the reasons that I freak out about. And even on the attempt to run austerity will reduce the profits of the capitalist economy. So there's so many things that people do from a class basis, an ideological point of view, which actually undermines their class interests. So again, if you look at Kolesky's work on the government deficit, this is brilliant work in his theories of. I've forgotten the actual name of the book, Dirk. It's behind me on the shelf here. But it's Economic Dynamics by Kolesky. And in it, he simply set a set of tables and said, what's an expenditure basis for GDP and what's an income basis for GDP? And then he took out the taxation level and found that fundamentally government spending adds to profits. So actually you want a higher level of profit, you want more government spending, not less. Now, the same thing applies with the Bancor. With the system we got, courtesy of the Americans and Harry Dexter White at Bretton Woods against Keynes's arguments, we got a national currency used as the basis of international trade. Now, that, of course, led to the American dollar being overvalued. It's the dynamics have changed over time, but fundamentally you needed more American dollars in circulation than you need just to buy American goods. That led to a high valuation for the American dollar. It led to American manufacturing being uncompetitive. American manufacturing capitalists lost out. Who won? American financial capitalists, because you needed the financial sector to get American dollars. You needed American dollars to buy assets globally. So it strengthened the vampire squids and undermined the manufacturing sector. So I think in a whole lot of ways, particularly American capitalists, would be better off if we had the Bancor, where you had it was not even a domestic currency. The Bancor was a unit of account. It wasn't a currency. So there was no international currency being used. There was just a clearinghouse. And that would have meant lower trade imbalances, more capacity for domestic producers to compete with imports, with exports from other countries. I think it'd have a higher level of profit. What's so frustrating for post-Keynesians in general is that most of their arguments about how capitalism would work better if we didn't follow neoclassical ideas. But the ideology that dominates is neoclassical. So out of that, you get an attempt to reduce government spending, which reduces profits. And then you have a tendency to run trade deficits, which actually undermine your domestic demand. And trade imbalances have lasted for decades. And this is Steve Moran's point that he made in defending Trump's tariffs. I'm no defender of the tariffs themselves, but I'm a defender of the argument we need trade balances. He said those trade imbalances were supposed to be removed by floating exchange rates, and 30 years later, Japan is still running a trade surplus, America is still running a trade deficit. The price system, as neoclassicals see it, as Austrians fantasize about it, doesn't actually exist. Exchange rates don't adjust fast enough to make up for the advances that one country's industries will make over another. So like Japanese cars, Japanese technology slaughtered Americans in the 80s and 90s, or 70s and 80s, and then they maintained those trade surpluses despite an appreciating Japanese currency. It didn't appreciate enough to undermine the advantages they were already making out of their technological advances and their finances. So in all these cases, if you had the stuff that Keynes argued for and that MMT argues for today, you'd have a more successful capitalist system. And that's why we get put across as the critics of capitalism. What we're critics of is stupid ideas about capitalism that make it work less well.
Very nice. Tony, buddy, where did you put it? Oh, here it is. Listen, I apologize, Tony. I did disappear on you. I know you are basically the biggest supporter of our live streams. And I was wrong. I shouldn't have disappeared. I should have said goodbye before I walked out the door, and I failed to do that. My beautiful common law partner always makes sure I give a kiss and hug and say goodbye before I walk out the door. So my bad. We are going to try to do this regularly.
You're going to try to do a kiss and hug for Tony, are you?
Yes, you're going to get kiss and hugs now, Tony.
Watch out, he's very sloppy. I've seen him in action. It's not pretty.
We are going to try to do this regularly. I got caught up with work stuff that was kind of at the end of the day. You got to pay the bills, and Steve was busy at the time, so we're going back to hopefully regular Saturday morning, Saturday evening for Europeans, and your time, Tony, 2:00 in the morning in Brisbane, Australia. So we're gonna try to stick around. We're getting short on time here, about 15 minutes. Let's see what we've got for more questions. And by the way, I know we have Austrian viewers here. If you have instead of maybe being critical of MMT all the time, if you have a question about Austrian economics, like Steve and I are big fans of Schumpeter, for instance, and we actually think he should be the face of Austrian economics as opposed to Mises and the other guy that always battled Keynes. So if
Yeah.
you got Hayek, if you've got a question about Austrian economics, feel free to answer it, because for one, I know Steve, and this is where I've learned a lot of my economic. He's broadly knowledgeable across all schools, right? So, and there are things about Austrian economics that make me think, geez, okay, there's something there. You guys, are do the deductive stuff a little bit too much for me, but you raise some valid questions, so we'll accept those questions. We've got one. This one is, well, we can do it, Dirk. Did I do this one already? Can MMT fundamentally stabilize capitalism long term, or will a crisis still occur under a perfect example of this model? Again, kind of referring to MMT as a policy versus a description. Dirk, handle this question. We've kind of done it a few times already today, but
Yeah. Now, I would like to refer to the general theory by John Maynard Keynes, where he says that two of the main problems of capitalism is that there's no mechanism that leads to full employment, and also that there's no mechanism that leads to a fair and just distribution of income and wealth. And that is inherent in capitalism. So MMT is not a theory that helps to, I mean, it can be misused to stabilize capitalism if it's an unfair system. But of course, there are political limits. So you cannot use macroeconomic stabilization policy to stop a revolution if the income goes, let's say 99% of the extra income goes to 1% of the people. If that would happen, and the US got there kind of in the 2000s, if that happens, then of course you will have a lot of political instability, and people will question the system. So also when you even if you understand modern money theory, there will still be crises, financial crisis and normal recessions. I mean, we will have a job guarantee probably, and that would mean that there would be more automatic stabilizers. So the recession should not be as deep and as long as before, as in the last couple of decades. But of course, drafting a budget for price stability and full employment, the government also has a lot of uncertainty surrounding many issues, and we should not pretend that MMT-informed government will not make mistakes and get spending just right to produce full employment but no inflation. So that's not going to happen. But MMT can help policymakers to understand what the real trade-offs are and what the constraints of the economy are, looking at the inflation rate as something which indicates that there might be bottlenecks in the economy where there are shortages, and then they can react with supply side programs and not cut government spending across the board, for example. Also, it's the resources that limit the economy, and doesn't make sense to have idle workers being unemployed for many years. That's nonsense. It creates also political frustration. So MMT helps to have a better society. But once again, if some politicians understand MMT and says, I want to give all the money to the rich, and they get their money by producing tanks and military stuff, and we want to go into war, then of course this kind of knowledge can be used for these purposes. But I think that it has always been clear to the madmen and also authoritarian types that they can abuse the state's power to fulfill their goals. You didn't need really MMT to do that. So I mean, that has happened hundreds of times in history in developed countries in the past, but also today in developing countries where wars are waged because of some dictator misusing the monetary system.
And in fact, I want to carry on that one a bit further too, because I mean MMT, if you want to boil it down to what you can describe it as, it's an accurate description of how government money creation works. Okay. Now, what that's saying, if you have an accurate model for that, you can do better than you do if you don't know how it happens. But there's MMT specifically does not talk about the credit system, for example. That's more my work coming from Hyman Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. So MMT doesn't necessarily tell you how to handle private debt. What you have to have is the integrated view, and that's what I've designed my Ravel software to make it feasible to look at both government money creation and private money creation. You have to look at the credit system, and there are arguments that come out of the circuits of school, which comes out of Europe, people like Graziani and the French circuitists and so on, and Hyman Minsky, that argues for a constraint on private debt creation. So rather than worrying about government debt, we worry about private debt. So that's something which is outside MMT. Yeah.
Steve, actually, you're kind of hitting on a question here. So let's combine this question here with kind of how you're responding, just because I think it ties together. How can you help explain why private debt can be more dangerous for society than government debt? This was a kind of a question I had on cue there that kind of ties in. So
yeah. Well, in that case, private debt is used to finance private investment, and you can have an investment boom where firms take on more debt than they're able to service in a slump. And what you get out of that is a process where the private level of debt ratchets up over time through a series of booms and busts, and you can then get to the point where there's such a level of private debt in existence that when you have the slump start, so capitalists can no longer finance their interest payments out of cash flow, and they start accumulating that interest on the level of private debt, you get a runaway level of private debt, and you get a debt deflation. And this is where Minsky's thesis came from. It came from looking at the explanation that Irving Fisher gave for the Great Depression. And Fisher's explanation was that it's just, first of all, capitalism is a non-equilibrium system. So neoclassical economics analyzes everything from the point of view of equilibrium. And Fisher made that mistake himself before the 1929 crash wiped him out. Then in trying to explain it, he said, the system is always in non-equilibrium. You can't use equilibrium thinking. And what you can therefore have is periods where there's too much private debt and too little inflation. And he said, what can then happen is that when the people try to reduce their debt levels, by rather than borrowing more money to invest more, they try to reduce their debt by paying their debt off. They actually destroy money in the process. So when you repay debt, you do it by destroying money. There's suddenly less money in circulation. And then if everybody tries to do it at once, one way people will do that is cut their prices. So you're trying to cut your prices to make sure the consumer's coming through your door rather than your neighboring competitor's door. Your competitor does the same bloody thing, and what you get is deflation, massively falling prices, which amplifies the level of private debt. And the end result of that, if you don't have bankruptcies and you don't have government spending, is a collapsed economy. And you'll see plenty of examples of that in the 19th century. The Great Depression was the greatest of all. In the Great Depression, prices fell in the first 2 or 3 years by 10% per annum. GDP was falling by the same rate. You put that together, you're about a 25% per year fall in nominal GDP. So private debt causes debt deflations, which cause catastrophes. And if you look at what the post-war increase in the scale of government did, it gave you a stabilizer, and that when there was a downturn in the private sector, the government spending would automatically rise because taxation revenues would fall, welfare payments would rise, and that stabilized and stopped you falling into a debt deflation. So by far the biggest danger the debt causes is a debt deflation, and that's caused by private debt, government debt, which is accumulated, or government bonds, which are created when you service a deficit, which rises because of the downturn. It's actually effectively attenuating the crisis caused by the private sector. So private debt's the main worry. And that's why, again, it's so frustrating to see people panicking about government debt when it's private debt that causes crises.
Very nice. Thanks, Steve. Robinson Resources, thank you for tuning in to the channel. We appreciate it. Come back each week. We're just trying. We've done the show. Yeah, like and subscribe. Steve's starting to get the script down here. You guys won't even need me anymore. But we've done this show for 3 years. We took a little break, but we're gonna try like a Q&A live stream. That makes the most sense. It's been a successful 2 hours. We've covered a broad range of topics. So come back each week. No question is a stupid question. Well,
there are some Austrians that qualify and some Marxists as well.
There's some stupid questions, but
stupid questions,
generally, I what I mean is, if you feel like it's a low level question compared to maybe Steve Keen's, pretty high level understanding of economics, or Dirk's. That's not the case at all. Both these guys are natural born teachers, right? So there's no stupid questions in that regard. I'm sitting here learning as we go, and I consider myself a mid-level person, so there is no stupid questions. I'm glad you're here. I think we'll do one more question, and so I'll direct this one at Dirk, and it comes off as again maybe a little harsh on MMT, but it's asking a valid question. What about those who want to store value? Seems to me MMT does not pay enough attention to that function of money, and I think MMT does. But he has a valid question, and maybe Dirk, how could you address that?
Yeah, well, the store value function is normally concerned with having money when you're old. Okay, so when you are working, you want to save money, and then you want to use that money when you're old. So you use money as a store of value, except that nobody's putting cash under the mattress anymore. Instead, you buy financial assets, you're buying government bonds, you're speculating maybe with real estate, whatever it is. So when it comes to the pension problem, if you want, then the MMT solution that we prefer normally is to say, look, it's the easiest thing is that we have the government paying the pension, so that those people who are contributing to the social security system, to the pension system, they are working, and part of the money they earn, they give back to the government, which is then destroyed in terms of purchasing power. And that, of course, means that people who are working, they are not able to afford to buy all the stuff that they produce because of these social security contributions, because of these pension system contributions. So that means that the government can give new money to the pensioners, and they can buy a lot of goods, which they are able to buy because you have collected social security contributions from the others. So that is a very simple system. So the important thing to understand here is that the cake, if you want. So if you look at GDP and it's a big cake, and if the pensioners want a slice and they're not participating in the process of baking the cake, then of course the only way you could give them something is to give them money, and that they can take a part of this cake. Of course, this cake is only at the maximum level when you have full employment. So when there's a lack of demand, you can give pensioners more money, they will buy more things, and then you will have more employment, more resource use, and also more and higher profits. With increasing returns to scale, you will also have higher productivity, by the way. So that is the way that we would solve this problem of using money as a store of value, that we would think that a strong pension system would work. And for those who are self-employed, you could say that the government bonds would pay an interest rate which is at the same level as the target rate of inflation, so that over the decades, if there's an inflation rate of 2% on average, then you get also an interest rate of 2%. That would be one possible solution. You could also offer government bonds which are just sold to households, so banks cannot buy them. So normal government bonds have, for example, 0 interest rates, and then those which can be purchased by households or the self-employed they have 2% of an interest rate. So these are the solutions. And of course, if you want to build up more assets, you're always free to do what you can do now. I mean, you can always borrow money, buy a house, buy a flat, or buy a car if you are a car collector, and speculate with that. So I think that there's a lot of possibilities that are highlighted by the MMT community. And of course, we don't pretend that there's one solution which solves all these problems. But I think that using the public pension system creates a better deal, because you do not have these high fees that you have when you manage money by private actors. So just to give you an idea, I think in 2020, the CNBC published numbers, and they said that the 25 best earning or highest earning hedge fund managers earned a total of something like $40 billion. So that was an average annual income of more than $1 billion. And of course, that means we just experienced Elon Musk, and we experienced how you buy political influence, how you buy an election. And that means there's more of these billionaire types who are able to buy an election. And it's really dangerous for a democracy to do this. So I think that MMT has a very good solution to this problem of managing money. That you basically say let the government do it via a pension system, where you just have a couple of public employees doing the social contributions and then the payouts, and no money managers or hedge fund managers involved, which make billions of dollars. I think that's a very good solution.
Thanks, Dirk. The hasty ant. Again, it's not Steve's fault. It's my fault. I do the notifications. We do a notification 2 days before the live stream. If we're live streaming, it comes up on Thursday. This week I did it Friday because it was kind of just, are we even going to do this anymore? If you don't see a notification, it means there won't be any live stream. But I apologize. It's on me, not Steve. I'm sorry, Steve. You got in trouble here.
You're getting spanked, mate.
No, this one's on you though. Very disappointed that now. TK, are you more on the Marxist side of things, or are you an Austrian?
We need an explanation there. Yeah, come on.
Yeah. And
who are you feeling disrespected by being?
Yeah. Let's just put it this way: as much as MMT gets its hate, or Austrians gets its hate, or Marxist gets its hate. Ultimately, if you look at it from the general public, there is a deep mistrust in economics altogether, and that is actually focused on mainstream economics, right? And so,
I'm on YouTube. Yes. Sorry. Sorry, hang on.
Steve's
sorry. I was copying a domestic criticism at the moment, so I had to explain why I wasn't responding to my wife in the kitchen. So apologies there. What was I being criticized now? This is
no, so you're good. Oh, what else do we have? Oh, yes. Let's just finish this off on great notes. Steve gives great disrespect. That came right after your Marxist Austrian equivalent.
I've given up on being polite. I mean, the second chapter of Debunking Economics was no more Mr. Nice Guy. And I've decided to put it into practice. I'm going to annoy the shit out of everybody.
No, that's good. That's what we need. We need that dialogue. But anyways, guys, it's been a great 2 hours. Dirk, I'm really happy you had a chance to come on for round 3. Of course, you're always
a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You're always welcome to drop by, right? You're a great insight and a benefit to economics in general. Anyways, guys, we will be back next week, I think, unless Steve's marketing advisor fires us, which there's always that chance. But we should be back next week. So until then, thank you and goodbye.